The July 1922 issue of the Pacific Marine Review used the Alaska as an example of how much all ships could benefit from having radio compass equipment. Quote, "For 2 hours prior to the grounding of the Alaska, its radio operator had been trying to obtain radio bearings by transmitting the radio compass station on shore at Eureka, California, but had been unable to get in communication with that station. The failure to obtain radio bearings was due in part to the fact that a large number of ships were endeavoring to obtain radio bearings at the same time."
Hello, and welcome to the Shipwreck Archive.
Thank you. Would you happen to have the story? The Alaska Strikes Blunt's Reef.
Here we are. Enjoy!
The Alaska had been built in 1889. The 3,709-ton steel-hulled steamship had begun life as a Kansas City. As the Kansas City, she had plied between New York and Cuba until 1898. She was shifted to the Pacific, where for a year she traveled between San Francisco and the Philippines as an army transport. Once she was brought over to the Pacific side of the United States, she remained there, traveling between Seattle and Alaska. In 1915, she was purchased by the Alaska Steamship Company, who gave her a complete overhaul and renamed her the Alaska. As the Alaska, she was put on a route between Seattle and Alaska, but in 1920, she was chartered by the San Francisco and Portland Steamship Company. As the company's name suggested, she was now placed on a route between San Francisco and Portland. On August 5, 1921, the Alaska departed from Astoria, Oregon, headed to San Francisco. On board she had 132 passengers, as well as a crew of 82, under her full capacity of 250 passengers and a crew of 112. They were sailing under the command of Captain Hobie, who was considered an experienced captain, though he had only been a captain of the Alaska for 3 weeks and had only made 3 trips in command of her. There was nothing to suggest on the Alaska that this was not going to be a routine voyage. By the next evening, the Alaska was in a heavy fog. Captain Hobie took his station in the wheelhouse due to the lowered visibility, while the second mate climbed to the cross trees to try to see through the fog. Despite these precautions, at no point was an order given to slow down the Alaska, which continued traveling at full speed. None of the officers trying to catch a glimpse of where they were through the fog were aware that they were no longer on course by several miles. A new current, caused by winds traveling parallel to the coast, and therefore not on the charts, was carrying them towards the shore. The Alaska did not have a radio compass, and instead they relied on getting radio bearings from compass stations on shore. With a large number of ships traveling up and down the coast in the fog, the station in Eureka was finding itself overwhelmed, however, and though for 2 hours the radio operator of the Alaska attempted to get their bearings, they were not sent. Still, the Alaska did not slow down. It was therefore at her top speed that she drove bow first into Blunt's Reef, off of the coast of Northern California. Blunt's Reef had claimed many ships in the past. It was a well-known navigational hazard. 15 years before, the Columbia, owned by the same owners as the Alaska, had struck on the reef with loss of life. It was clear that the Alaska would not have ventured near the reef if Captain Hobie had known of its proximity. As it was, the vessel striking on the reef was a complete shock to everyone on board. Shortly after the first shock, a second followed, as the Alaska struck a second time. The Alaska's bow was almost entirely ripped from the ship. The Alaska did not remain on the reef, but instead was washed back by the swell without even the reef she had struck to keep her afloat a little longer. Captain Hobie gave the order for the pumps to be started, but they were not able to keep up with the rush of water that was entering the ship through the gaping hole in her bow. The Alaska began to list to starboard almost immediately. Aware that the ship was in danger of sinking, the radio operator put out a distress signal while the crew began to prepare the lifeboats. The passengers had been blissfully unbothered by the fog that had enveloped the ship. Some of the passengers had already retired for the night, while others had been dancing on the hurricane deck when the shock came. The passengers could not help but notice the blow that the ship had suffered. They rushed to the deck, many of them in nightclothes, to be met by crew members who did their best to reassure them. The crew variously told the passengers that the ship had struck a whale or that it had grounded, but no matter what the story was told, passengers were assured that the ship was in no danger of sinking, and that they would be able to evacuate in an orderly fashion. Whether or not the evacuation was actually orderly depended on who was telling the story. A passenger named Mr. Springstead would later make the allegation that only 15 members of the crew had lifeboat certification, and bosun Helmer would say that the number was only 6, and that he was forced to dismiss 9 of the 14 men under his command to other duties when they proved unable to launch lifeboats. First Officer McClintock would say it was 10 members of the crew who were lifeboatmen. Other complaints came from passenger Miss Shipley, who would say that even though the evacuation was supposed to be women and children first, some of the men had acted badly and shoved everyone else aside in order to reach the lifeboats. Others prioritized seeing their families safe. One woman told of finding a place in a lifeboat with her daughter, only to have a wild-eyed man shove a baby into her arms. Springstead found a place on a lifeboat for his wife of less than a week, but remained behind, there being no place for him. Though many would speak of panic, many of the other passengers and crew would say that the passengers and crew all remained calm, and did their best given the circumstances. There were some agreements about people who did act well. Captain Hobie personally went among the passengers and helped them into lifeboats. He was recognized as having been calm and professional throughout. Of the crew, the waiters in particular were recognized for trying to keep everyone calm and reassuring everyone that everything would be fine. All of the passengers received lifebelts, which were credited with having saved many lives. What side of the ship passengers and crew were on had a strong impact on their perception of how the evacuation went. All of the passengers on the starboard side were placed in lifeboats, though the fourth lifeboat capsized while being launched and everyone in it was thrown into the water. It was later calculated that most of the passengers who were lost had been placed in that lifeboat. Bosun Helmer was on the port side, however, and his complaints about how incompetent the crew under him was reflected how poorly things went on that side of the ship. Passengers would complain that there were still lifeboats left untouched as the ship was making her final plunge. 5 miles from where the Alaska was going down, the Antiochs of Vancouver received the first distress call of the Alaska at 9:18 and turned to head in the direction of the distressed ship as quickly as possible. She was slowed by the heavy barge that she was towing, but Captain Snoddy pushed her as much as he could, in spite of the heavy fog, and the fact that he was heading in a direction where it was known that there were navigational hazards. Shortly after the first distress message, they received another, informing them that passengers were taking to the boats, and then one final message: "We are sinking by the head." There would be no further messages from the Alaska, and the crew of the Antiochs could only stare anxiously into the mist. On the Alaska, those passengers who did not make it into lifeboats stood on the deck beside Captain Hobie. Among their number was Mr. Springstead. He made a decision and leaped into the ocean rather than remain on the sinking ship. 4-year-old Betty Sanders was bundled in a blanket and a lifebelt by her grandmother before being torn from her as the ship made its final lurch. Passenger Mr. Ross took off the lifebelt that he was wearing and held it out to Captain Hobie, telling him to save himself. Captain Hobie walked away, saying that he preferred to go down with his ship. Captain Hobie walked to the stern of his ship, having done everything he could. He would remain there until the end. A single man, with no family remaining, Captain Hobie lived with a couple in Tacoma when he was not on duty. The couple told the newspapers later that Captain Hobie had a horror of the water and could not swim. He had told them on multiple occasions that he expected to perish at sea, and that if disaster did occur, he intended to go down with his ship. He kept his word. For many of the other people on board of the ship, going down with the ship was never an option. As she sank, her boilers, which had been kept going until the end by the dutiful engineering crew in order to power the wireless, exploded, ripping the ship in half. Many of the passengers and crew were thrown into the water. Oil from the ship's tanks splattered the water, the people in the water, and the people on the final boat to leave the Alaska, which had remained nearby. Mr. Springstead, who spent hours on a raft until being rescued, credited the oil with saving his life. He said it calmed the waves around them and soaked their clothes, keeping them warm because it repelled the cold water. For others it was less fortunate. They slipped from the grasp of those who tried to pull them to safety and keep them afloat, and they were lost. The blast also freed another lifeboat, which drifted nearby and allowed some of the survivors to climb to safety. Others remained in the water, clinging to the wreckage or held up by the lifebelts. In the dark fog, they had no way of knowing how close or far help was. It took the Antiochs an hour to find the first lifeboat, the last lifeboat to have departed from the Alaska. With the first load of survivors on board, the Antiochs began to search for others. Realizing that not all of the survivors had reached the boats, second mate Sinclair of the Antiochs and 3 volunteers took a lifeboat they had rescued from the Alaska and in the space of half an hour pulled 30 people to safety. They continued their search through the night, and through the night they found more people floating in the water. As dawn broke, they found the last few, all people who had survived the cold water through the night, including Betty Sanders, who had survived for 7 hours. She was immediately wrapped in a blanket, and was doted on by the survivors, as well as the crew of the Antiochs. No one told her that her grandmother was among those lost. About an hour later, another little girl was pulled from the water. 5-year-old Eileen Dyer had been in the lifeboat that had capsized, as well as her mother and twin siblings. For 8 hours, Eileen had drifted until she was lifted, unconscious but alive, up to the deck of the Antiochs. Once revived, she immediately cried for her parents. Out of her family, it was found that only her father had survived, injured and almost mad with grief. He reportedly was somewhat soothed when he found that Eileen had at least survived. But witnesses said that Eileen's sobbing over her injured father was heartbreaking. There would be many heartbreaking scenes, as family members rushed to find out if their loved ones had survived or not. The crew of the Antiochs did what they could. Even after the ship departed the site of the wreck for Eureka, having injured people on board who needed immediate medical attention, they left behind one of their boats to continue the search. More ships were joining in the hunt for survivors, but all they were pulling from the sea were remains. There would also be joyful reunions. Betty Sanders would meet with her parents holding a new doll to replace the one she had lost in the wreck. Mr. and Mrs. Springstead would be united on the deck of the Antiochs, where Mrs. Springstead had held a vigil for 7 hours, worried that she would be made a widow on her honeymoon. They had lost everything, but told the newspapers that did not matter to them. They were just happy to be together again. The Red Cross was already standing by to offer them clothes to the relief of one female passenger who immediately excused her wardrobe to the newspapers. She was wearing a skirt but no shirtwaist, a single shoe, and a men's hat. She had been in the boat that had been covered in oil, and the men had found it too difficult to row with the slick oars, so she had sacrificed her shirtwaist to them to clean the oil off. On shore, she suddenly found herself self-conscious of her appearance. No one was going to criticize her for appearing disheveled. The losses were too heavy. The final tally of those believed to be lost was 42, and things were made worse by the very few remains that were recovered, and the uncertain records that were kept of who was aboard the Alaska for her final voyage. The first investigation that was made was an inquest over those remains that were recovered. There the passengers made many charges about a poorly trained crew and poorly maintained lifeboats. Some of the passengers also alleged that the captain and first mate had not been on the bridge in spite of the fog. The charge that the captain had not been on the bridge was quickly refuted, but the inquest declined to decide any of the other matters, deciding to leave it to a federal inquiry that had been called. They merely found that the people who had been lost had drowned. The federal inquiry was not to offer the survivors much more satisfaction. Many of them would later say that they had not even been told when it was, so they were not present, even though they had desired to testify. They wanted to talk about an incompetent crew and lifeboats that were badly launched and poorly maintained. They would not get a chance except in the newspapers. Though charges were brought against all of the officers of the Alaska, the blame in the end would be placed entirely on Captain Hobie and his faulty navigation. Whether or not there was an uncharted current, that the Alaska had been traveling at full speed was criticized. It was also noted that there was a light ship nearby with a foghorn, and Captain Hobie had been looking for it, though he had not seen it, right before they had struck the reef. The Columbia had been the only major shipwreck on Blunt's Reef since the lightship had been established. That he knew it was there and had done nothing to alter his course meant that no matter how nobly Captain Hobie had behaved after the Alaska had hit the reef, he could not escape responsibility for the loss of his ship. For more information, please see The Morning Oregonian from August 8, 1921, or see our other sources in the description below. Thank you for listening.
Thank you for visiting the Shipwreck Archives. See you soon.